All right.
Okay.
Celebration. So I hit record. Hi, welcome to Stephen Has Questions episode. Who knows? I realized that I should have been doing this the entire time instead of having to like edit them in. So just because obviously part of why I'm doing this is to make people aware of what I do. I will be inserting short little commercials. They won't be too long. Hopefully, they won't be too annoying um, in the midst of these. So there you go. Um, Today we are with, and I knew your name a second ago.
Amanda
Angela, it's right there.
Madden. Yes.
Yes, excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get into what you do in a minute, but let me ask you my starter question, which is, as a kid, what was the first thing that like it doesn't have to be related to what we're going to be talking about, but that you really sunk your teeth into, that you want to know everything about?
Music.
Hmm.
Yeah, I started playing the piano when I was 4 or 5, or at least that's what I remember playing the piano. And I begged my parents for piano lessons, and they finally relented around 6. I took piano lessons for a little while. And it was I had a hard time kind of focusing on, learning music formally, and then kept begging my parents for piano lessons again. And so went and they put me back in piano lessons. And so they put me in piano lessons with, there was not only learning the music, but also learning like the music theory,
Hmm.
and there was that component to it as well. And as well as, just group lessons, performing. It's kind of a mini conservatory, basically. They found a mini conservatory.
Hmm.
And I became obsessed. Like I would spend, I don't know, hours of my life listening to the radio, just analyzing songs. I would listen to like my parents, like, I mean, I guess this shows my age. My parents' classical records, right? And anytime I could, like, I'd listen to like Disney soundtracks. Just obsessed with
Hmm.
like deconstructing music. And so I started checking out books on music, right? Just to like learn more about technique and music theory and to music history. And I remember when I saw Amadeus
Hmm.
when I was very, very young, it just like lit a fire inside of me. Like I was obsessed. I was obsessed with classical music. Um,
What a great reference to like anybody who hasn't seen it yet, since this is an older film since I remember when it came out. But yeah, it's definitely from a charismatic musician point of view, the way he plays it, and it's not at all accurate apparently to the actual relationship between Amadeus and Salazar.
yeah, Salieri.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah, that's
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
But still, fantastic film, and I highly recommend it.
It's just restored. Have you seen the restored version? The
Mhm.
Criterion just restored it, and it's available. So we just bought it and watched it recently. And I don't know. It'd probably been 10 years. My partner's a film snob, so he wanted to wait until it came out restored on Criterion. Valid, right? That's one of his things. He's very passionate about film. But it blew me away, and it really brought back like how it just the way Salieri described like Mozart's music and his
Mhm.
playing and his technique just kind of lit my brain on fire, and that's all I wanted to learn about. So that was my music was my first obsession.
A clip from it recently, and it one of my favorite parts about it. And I am not a musician. Contrary to what I have done, I'm not that kind of musician. Like I'm really good at using tools and figuring out how to make things do what I want them to do. Whereas with visual art, that's a whole other thing. And this is definitely one of those things I can definitely relate to from a painting standpoint. But there's this great scene where Mozart sits down and he's got like part of a song that the other guy wrote, and he's like, "Da-da-da-da." It's
Yeah.
like, yeah, but that doesn't quite work, does it? And then he just comes up with just off the cuff,
Yeah.
like all of these variations on it.
Yeah.
And that that's the kind of shit that I love. That's actually the kind of shit part of why I want to do this, or I've been doing this thing, is because it's so cool talking to people who are that know that much and are that passionate about the things that they do. So do you still do music, or is this
Not as much as I would like. It's funny. That was my first, it was my first love and it was my first career choice. I actually dropped out of high school to pursue a music career, which is wild to think about in retrospect. All my students and colleagues are like, wait a minute, you're a high school dropout, you have a PhD, whatever. Like that's, there
No,
are,
I think that that's actually really important. Like
yeah,
Donna, my wife, who's an author, didn't go to school for writing, and she'll sometimes she's just like, I just feel like I'm a fake because all these other people I know all went to school for it, but fuck that, like,
yeah,
or like
agreed.
I don't know dick about music. I've written music that's gone into space, so
Right.
it's like those pieces of paper are really only sort of matter, and often not with the people that really are important or matter. So
100% agree with that. In academia, I mean, it is the case that, I have lots of colleagues who, went to really great high schools and really great, anyway, that's a whole nother, that's a whole nother kind of,
no, I wanted to. I looked into doing teaching at a college level at one point, and it really cheeses me that I have to have a master's in order to do it because I'm
I
like, I've
agree.
owned away more work than most people do. I've owned art galleries.
Yeah, absolutely.
My work was shown in the White House. I mean, what more do you want me
Yeah.
to do? So, yeah, it really annoys the shit out of me, but whatever.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very credential-based system. So I dropped out of high school. I wanted to pursue a music career. I specifically wanted to be, at the time, like a heavy metal musician. I was starting to really get into death metal. I mean, I was also one of the goth kids. I was really into goth music. And, I guess what we would have called alternative at that at that point. But the bands never came together, and just things never clicked. And finally, at a certain point, I was like, you know what, I'm just gonna try college. My parents were really, like, are you sure you don't want to go to college? And I did, and I started taking courses, and even though I was just the absolute worst student in high school, I soaked it up. I was just like, I could not get enough. Like I could not read enough. I don't know what it was about college. It just really, maybe it's just more self-determined, and
But also, you're an adult. You're at least older,
yeah,
more mature. I have an ongoing theory that part of the reason the country is in the place it is right now is that there's two kinds of people. There's the people that when they're in school, like later in school, where they're like, okay, cool, I'm paying you for this. Teach me, bring it up,
yeah,
bring it up. And then there are the ones who, even though they may consciously know that, if you question them about it, but there's still that part of them that sees learning as something that is inflicted on them.
yeah.
Like, look, I'm going to get the teacher this year, but you're paying
Right.
me to teach you this. Yeah, I'm going to get you too.
Yeah,
And I think it's like they don't grow out of that.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, lots could be said about what's happened to our education system in the
Oh,
last 20 years, right? And like how students are taught. But I don't know. And I mean, I'm the first person to say college is not for everyone, right? Like, and you can, I mean, as long as like you're just committed to learning whatever it is, whether it's about like gardening or like sourdough, bread baking.
learning is cool. Like that's really ultimately what it comes down to. It's like learning is cool, and you know, it blows my mind that there are people that are kind of like, okay, I'm done with that.
Yeah. I will never be done with that.
Right.
Yeah, ever, ever. I mean, I'm so, so fortunate that I found what I did when I did and that I was good at it. And then I just was like in a position where just the stars aligned. And, I did really well in college, was found my, future career.
Yeah. So let's actually get into that because I think you might be one of the most specific people I've had on which is
Yeah.
really cool. And the fact that you actually have a career doing it is pretty amazing. So, tell us exactly what it is you do.
So, I'll start slightly more vague, or I'll start slightly more broad. I am a professor of history, specifically an assistant professor of history at George Mason University here in Fairfax, Virginia, so in Northern Virginia. My official title is Professor of Early Modern and Digital History. That's what I was hired to teach. My area of expertise is violence, and specifically violence in early modern Italy. And specifically, even more specific than that, I have a book coming out on vendetta violence in early modern Italy in November. So that's really right now my area of expertise is the Italian vendetta, which is very specific.
Um, yeah, it was funny because I remember I first became aware because through our friend Nathan, he's my drummer,
Yeah.
who we were on tour, and that came up, and I was like, really, that's crazy. But let me backtrack because I'm curious what the digital history was.
Yeah. So digital history, I'm also, in addition to being with the history and art history department, I'm part of the Roy Rosenberg Center for History and New Media, which does a lot of digital history projects and public history projects, of, either exhibits,
Hmm.
of like historical documents that are interpreted. We do podcasts. We have a podcast studio. We create data-driven projects which show like historical data. Like one of my colleagues has this fantastic project that takes the bills of mortality from 17th century London, which were these really crazy sources that were kind of like newsletters that
Hmm.
talked about when and how people died.
Hmm.
That you could pass around London, you could go pick up on the corner for however much. So she has a digital
It's like
project.
having obituaries in a
Yeah,
newspaper.
yeah, yeah. But they were just passed around, and
Mhm.
people would buy them and read them out. And this is plague era
Mhm.
London, so I think people were particularly obsessed with death, of course. But she has taken some of these bills because they've been digitized, and has put together a project where you can kind of see the data and see deaths by parishes, and you play around with it like it's interactive.
Right.
So when I think of digital history, I think of making history interactive,
Hmm.
not just for me, but for students. I'm actually working on a project right now, which I'm hoping will get launched sooner rather than later, which is mapping violence, like mapping where violence takes place in Venice and the Veneto. So I'm looking at, and also Bologna and a couple of other cities in Italy. So I'm looking at, okay, this church was really bad, in 1625. Like there were a lot of like killings that took place in and around that church. Just so you can analyze the patterns, and also, I think history should be for everyone.
Absolutely.
And so I like doing digital history because you can put together projects where people can interact with it. Another project that we have going on is really cool. There is a 15th century geographic text written by a Florentine merchant called Gorodati. And here it's this really strange text that was written in poetry and has like, different illustrations. And it was a viral text in the sense that it was really popular. And so a bunch of manuscripts were copied from the original text, and they all have different illustrations. And some of them are crazy. Some of them are just like, I don't know, there's like 27 different versions of the Tower of Babel, and they,
Mhm.
they just all have weird, sort of like creative illustrations. So we're putting together a project that has digitized this and
Mhm.
like kind of talks about the different editions, and you can kind of play around with it and interact with it. So that's
So,
digital history.
yeah, no, that's great. So it's not digital in the sense that it's archiving stuff. It is actually creating a platform. Uh,
Yeah.
I had somebody on another episode, and he works at Yale, and he's in charge of the herpetology lab there. And one of the things that they're doing is they're like, well, we have all of this data, right? And zoos have all of this data,
Yeah.
but we haven't actually put it together. So now one of his big things is getting it all together so that they can like actually look and see what other people know, which is
Yeah.
really cool.
That's it's I think that's one of the fantastic things about technology now. I mean, one of the benefits, it definitely has its downsides, but being able to share data. I
Mhm.
really like doing collaborative work, right? Like, and so it's great that I have, data or historical materials that I've collected that I can share with my friends. I can just send them a file of like the
Right.
pictures I've taken in the archives, and
Yeah, living in the future is cool. Mm.
yeah, yeah, for the most part.
Right, and obviously, there are downsides, but yeah, I'm forever amazed. I'm like, hey, I just wrote somebody for a buddy of mine in Chicago. There you go.
Yeah, yeah.
So, so I can't imagine anybody thinks to themselves, I'm going to go into Italian vendettas, and that's how I'm going to go to school. So how did you get from zero to that?
Oh, this is a wild story. So this wild story starts. It was really early in the morning. In 2005, I was working on my master's thesis. And the original topic of my master's thesis is someone has suggested to me, I was really interested in women's writing specifically. There's a lot of great text written by Italian women in the 16th and 15th, 16th, and 17th century. People just don't know about. I mean, they were really popular at the time. They have some interesting things to say. But, a lot of people just don't know about those texts. So that was my original kind of form of, that was my original topic.
You keep, I just have curiosity real quick.
Sure.
Talking about how it's popular. I just don't remember the date on Gutenberg. So was this pre or before? And if it was before, how was it getting out?
So this was post Gutenberg.
Okay.
And so what happens in Italy is a lot of states, or even just people, put out a shingle, right, and start printing stuff. And there's a lot of stuff a lot of books were printed. I think we sort of have this idea that, printing presses were, just printing books for doctors to read medical manuals or whatever.
Yeah, it seems like
they're printing all sorts of crazy stuff. Mm-hmm. Right? Like some of the craziest stuff, and this will get into, my going back to the vendetta story. Some of the stuff, like people challenging someone else to a duel, they would just go to a printer and have it printed. So we actually have these, right? That's somewhat yeah, of course. That, you can look and see, okay, like Giovanni Pescara, challenged, Boccaccio to a duel, and, would have it printed, like paste it somewhere so everyone can see it. Yeah, so that was really common. So you have all sorts of really cool ephemera, or just, I don't know, a lot of really interesting stuff is printed. So I was really interested in women's writing, and I knew that there was women's writing that had been printed. And I just wrote another researcher, and he said, look, there's this nun's diary that was written in 1520s, which is really interesting. Some people have talked about it. I've looked at it. Nobody has ever worked on it. And it's a very interesting document because it's actually more of a history than like a diary at the convent. And I was like, okay, I'm convinced. I'm not sure I want to work on nuns, but sure, let's do it. And so, I interlibrary loaned it, like the modern edition, pulled it out, was looking through it, and I was like, this seems kind of boring. It's just kind of a daily account. Like, she went and looked at, she went with her nurse to look at the, new building that was being built, or she visited the convent, or, her uncle died, right? I was like, I'm not sure this is particularly interesting material. This was not the sexy I was promised. So, I kept with it because, I was like, okay, there's got to be something.
Gotta be a reason, yeah.
Yeah, there's something here. So I kept kind of grinding through it, and I was like, wow, I'm seeing some really interesting family stuff, and, this is, for a nun's diary, this is incredibly secular. So let's work on that. Let's try and figure out why this nun's diary is so secular. Like, she's barely talking about her religious life at all. And so one night, I had noticed there was a poem in it. Like there were 3 or 4 pages of a poem. And I didn't really want to touch the poem because I'm not really good. I love poetry. I'm not great at translating Italian poetry. It's not my area of expertise. I was, just trying to avoid it. I wasn't sure that it really fit. Like, I really didn't kind of want to, I was just...
It seemed like it would be really involved.
Yeah, I think I was also just being a coward. Like, I didn't want to do that kind of literary analysis. So I was like, I want to analyze this. This is interesting. I'm sure it's great. It's a poem, whatever. So one of my committee members for my master's thesis, who was a literary historian, was, like, you have to translate this. Like, you have to do this. And so I was like, okay, fine. She says I have to translate it. I have to translate it. So I was very much a night owl at that point in my life, and I was staying up. I was living in this really crappy old house in Michigan. It was really cold. It was like February, and my roommates had gone to sleep, and I was up in this old, drafty, atmospheric house by myself in the living room, like translating this poem. And I was like, I'm not sure what's happening here. Like, this is really, really strange. And then I ran across this line that's basically, I'm going to give the rough translation, but it said, friends and family will rush to punish this senseless malice and make our vendetta so fatal that the infinite abyss will be amazed. And I read that, and I just, like, chills came over me. I'm like, it was like really the first time in my life, like, I felt like
Yeah,
these
yeah.
people from 500 years ago were actually speaking, and
Right, right.
it was creepy. I wasn't sure really liked what they were saying per se.
Well, it's 500 years ago, so it's not
Yeah,
gonna, they're not you. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, and I was just like, I was dumbstruck. I was like, what the hell is this doing in a nun's diary,
right.
right? What does this say about, what's happening? And so that changed everything. I mean, that moment really changed everything. And, I shifted the topic of my thesis very quickly to, to start looking at vendetta. And I realized that I had just skipped over some entries that were talking about this vendetta between two families. And so went on to get my PhD and, started doing archival work in archives in Italy and started tracking down, the vendetta and the pieces, the relevant information or trying to find relevant information. It was interesting. I hit a dead end the first time I was in the archives, right? Like I'd been following footnotes and I'd kind of gone to the archivist. My Italian was not great at this point, and I was like, here's what I'm looking at. Do you have any suggestions? Like I'm trying to do research on this vendetta. Can you tell me more about it? And she gave me a funny look. She's like, crazy American who doesn't speak very good English. So, I was persistent. I kind of kept up with it. And because I was persistent and because there were the documents weren't great. It wasn't like there was this pile of documents that talked about this vendetta. I, just kept looking in different places in the archive. And then I noticed that information on this vendetta was everywhere. It was just dispersed.
Mhm.
Right. And so I kept researching and kept researching and researching and realized after, a point, I realized after a year or so doing this work, 2 years of doing this work, that like this was ubiquitous. Like it
Right.
wasn't just one family, it was a bunch of families in this town that were like involved in vendettas.
Mhm.
And not just like one vendetta, like vendettas that were stretching over decades, in at least a couple of cases, centuries. And I thought, yeah, this is something, we always think about Romeo and Juliet, and that sort of like stereotype of the Italian vendetta. But I was like, actually, I think, after looking at some of the what other historians have written about it, I was like, I think we need to study this more because, this is some crazy documentation and this
Yeah,
is
it's a
really
major
sort of
part of
impacting
life
things.
and death,
Yeah.
and it's that large scale. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it was a major phenomenon, and it was a major phenomenon not only in the city. I mean, I subsequently found many many more cases of vendettas in other cities in Italy. I mean, it was a widespread phenomenon, but this just you just kind of like digging and sifting through all these documents just made me realize how significantly this practice impacted everyday life in Italy. It also made me realize that what we think of a vendetta, like, the mad blood stirring that Shakespeare talks about, is not actually what a vendetta was. Like, vendettas were actually, like, very cold blooded. And, I think that's probably the best way to, like, look at it. Like,
Like a calculated thing.
they're very calculated, like, intensely calculated. Like, families would plan sometimes, as far as I can tell, years in advance when and how to strike. So, and they would not only plan years in advance when and how to strike, they would like get their wills in order
Mhm.
or start to embezzle their property so they wouldn't get their property confiscated in case they got in trouble or arranged for exile in advance. Like these families put a lot of effort and time into planning, these attacks. So yeah, I mean, I just realized it was a phenomenon that just really needed more study.
Mhm. Sorry, I'm doing my notes thing here.
Oh, no reason to apologize. I do the
Well,
same. I'm actually
it's not
strange
one of
that I'm
those
not
things
doing
that I'm
that.
trying to remind myself to do because otherwise I sit there and I'm listening and I've got like this mental post-it note going, go back to this, go back to this, go
The
back to this.
same. I'm
Totally
the
get
same.
myself here.
Yeah.
So it's cool. It's like you got to do a full-on like Umberto Eco sort of thing, all
Dude,
the research and all that shit. So, which actually got me thinking about that. You're talking about the documents. I'm assuming these are documents from the time period.
yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How are
Yeah.
they, how does that manifest? I mean, are they in book form? Or are they just like sheets of paper that are just arranged or?
It's way more chaotic than that.
Mhm.
So, the Italian archives are fascinating. And, when I was, a naive young historian before I even got into the Italian archives, I kind of assumed I had worked in archives as an undergraduate and I worked in archives as a master's student before I'd gone to the Italian archives and, decided I was going to do Italian history. And our archives are really well organized.
Oh,
Like you
yeah,
can
in my head, you're going down into a vault and it's candlelit. They're wearing
I
like
mean,
full
you're
on
not
monk robes.
far off, actually. You're not far off. In fact, a lot of the archives I worked in Italy are in former convents or monasteries.
Mhm.
So, like that atmospheric, sitting at a table surrounded by history is actually on point. And the Venetian archives in particular, have this sort of, I don't know, like Umberto Eco mystery feel to them because of the lighting and, the high ceilings and stuff. But
Room has six sides, and yeah, you have to.
absolutely. Yeah. No, and I'll have to send you a picture. They're
Yeah, I'd be
beautiful.
interested in seeing that. So maybe, I hope this isn't insensitive. I think it's culturally sensitive. Did this and there's other questions, but did this? Because when you think of these sorts of things, there's this immediate thought of like organized crime and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Did it evolve into that, or is it just a separate thing?
That's a good question. I get asked that a lot. And Italians, I think in general have been sensitive about the topic of vendetta in general
Right.
because of organized crime and how much it has impacted Italy. Even to today, right? So I think it was a sensitive topic, and I do actually think that is maybe one reason why not as many Italian researchers had really worked on this until maybe the last 15 or 20 years. I mean, there were other researchers who, alongside me or after me were like, actually, we should probably be studying this also, right? So,
Right.
I mean, as much as it would be cool to be the world's only expert in Italian vendetta, I do have a couple of colleagues who also
But
work on it.
still, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, so I do have a couple, particularly colleagues in Italy because, they're closer to the archives. But the Italian archives in general are just chaotic. Like they're not well organized. In some cases, like the Venetian archives in particular, where I've been working the last couple of years, are some of the largest archives in Europe. So literally, it's just rooms and rooms and rooms and rooms full of documents, some of which are organized okay-ish, some of which have not been organized at all, some of which are crumbling. So the first time I was in the Mona's archives working on this vendetta, like trying to research this stuff down, it just blew my mind because just randomly I was like, okay, I'm gonna look at this collection, just see what it says, see if there's anything in here, and like it's literally paper from the 16th century that has not been well preserved and is like crumbling in some cases in your hands, and you're like, am I supposed to touch this? Like, is this
Yeah.
okay? Or that it's been deteriorated or eaten by bugs or all sorts of things. But, like the Italians, to their credit, particularly the Italian archives, have really made it an effort to still keep, even documents that are in poor condition, just because it's a rich cultural heritage, right? Like there's a lot of great stuff in those archives. And so, like it's almost, no rhyme or reason. Like
Right.
sometimes you'll pull up something and you're like, oh my gosh, I've gotten like 25 pages of letters, on my topic. And then you'll look for the next, day or week or something, and you won't find anything.
Mhm.
But that's part of the fun, though, I
Oh, I'm
think.
sure. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, how excited? Like, do does you get in touch with them through your school and say, hey, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing? Or like, could any schmo off the street be like, hey, can I come in and see?
That is a really good question. I think when I started out, you were supposed to get in touch with them
Mhm.
beforehand and or take a letter from your dissertation advisor,
Mhm.
which I did. Like I took a letter. I mean, they didn't look at it. They're just
Right.
like, whatever. But I had a letter just in case they questioned my, credentials or ability. Um, so with that, when I first got started, in the archives, like 15, 20 years ago, yes, there was a lot more restriction. Now the Italians have really made an effort recognizing that their cultural heritage is, intensely rich and deserves to be preserved and, could easily go away, have really kind of opened up that, like old boys network of archival, collections. You still get it. I mean, sometimes I'll go into archives and, they're just like, no, you can't see this collection, or they'll ask to see like credentials, or they want to see like, they want me to fill out more forms. But, I'm no longer at that point in my career, fortunately. Like yeah, like I have, like I have colleagues in, certain cities. I can be like, hey, can you send an email on my behalf and promise them that I am actually legit,
Right.
which I've had to do a couple of times, but not as much anymore.
That's good.
Yeah.
So was the nun involved in any of this stuff? Like, was
the banana story? It gets crazier. The story gets crazier, believe it or not. So this nun who wrote this diary was part of a convent called San Lorenzo, and I could not figure it out at first until I started doing this research why this nun was writing about it, right? How she was involved. Was she, because she was really writing extensively about it, and she was talking about all these families and, So after doing the research, I realized this convent of San Lorenzo was founded because the two main families that this nun in particular was focusing on, the Bellancini and the Fontana, who'd been involved in a vendetta for at least 2 decades by the time she was writing her diary, had been fighting for 2 decades. And during the course of their fighting, their sisters or daughters who were nuns in another convent, the convent of San Gimignano, got into a fight. And the fight got so bad that the bishop and the duke and everyone else was like really concerned that violence was going to break out, which was a very realistic possibility. So they took one of the factions of the nuns out and said, okay, fine, this is getting so bad, like the city is getting ready to erupt in flames at any moment, and founded a brand new convent for them.
So a group of 2 sets of nuns already in a convent started fighting, and then they
yes. So they had a schism.
Like that goes against the whole thing.
Well, it does. I mean, it was just this is not supposed to happen. This is never supposed to happen. I mean, you're certainly not supposed to, found a convent because of a vendetta. Like,
right.
That's what happened. And so this nun who wrote the diary, Sor Lucia was her name, Sor Lucia Pioppi, was actually a member of the secondary convent that was started by one of the families. Mm-hmm. So because she had been professed in this convent, she would have been considered like a faction, like part of this faction, or part of the associated families. So she was very, and after I realized that, I realized there was a reason that she was talking about one of the families more than the others. And that was part of the faction. So, and I have subsequently learned it's not uncommon for vendettas to spill either out of, like, be started in convents, and or for vendettas to creep into convents.
I have heard about how women talk about each other.
Yes.
Did you hear what that?
Yeah. Imagine that with knives.
She missed Vespers, and now it's a whole thing.
Yeah.
So, all right. So how do they start? How did the? I mean, I imagine it's any cornucopia of reasons, but do you know what's the impetus for some of this stuff?
That's a really good question, and that's something that I don't think.
I can see your cat's tail, as it walks on the wall.
I called her Maya Saralinda because in the Richard Adams book, Maya is the dancer, and she's supposedly really good with her hips, and this cat, she wiggles.
She got the thing.
She's got the thing, and that's why I called her that. Back to nuns and vendettas. Or just vendettas in general. It's really interesting. That was one of the pieces of the puzzle I think was missing before that other researchers hadn't really kind of discussed, is very rarely do these families talk about why a vendetta was started. Like, you don't actually have anyone, write up a manifesto.
Right.
There's a couple of diaries out there that talk about it, and they may
imagine there's a lot of, we all know why we're here.
Right, exactly. So that's the fascinating part, is it's almost like this open secret about why a vendetta started between two families. And sometimes this, the reasons for the vendetta like were 200 years before, right? I mean, and I think for the Italians, and I talk about this a little bit in my book, I think for the Italians in this context, who were fighting these vendettas, how it started was less important.
It gave them an other. It gave them
Yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah. It just wasn't.
It's like they were maybe. Is there a sense actually that yes, it does. It's a horrible thing. People die, blah blah blah. But there's also a unification and a sense of, um,
Absolutely.
yeah, that like gives you almost legitimate. Like I imagine if you're in a family that's getting to a certain size
Yeah.
and don't have something like this going on, everybody's kind of like, well, we don't really think you're that legit until you like
Start a vendetta, you'll move up in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, that's actually not that wrong. There's an Italian phrase, giochi di squadra, which is like, it's kind of like the sense of like a soccer team. Um, I mean, I think that's the best way to translate it. Someone who knows Italian is going to, object to this translation, but that's how I think of the translation. So it was a group endeavor, right? And very much vendettas were a group endeavor. They fostered solidarity among the families and the associates, but they also fostered solidarity among the enemies, right?
Mhm.
I mean, there's still
Yeah.
a sense of, communal, like, hey, we're all in this together, even if
Right,
like,
yeah,
sorry
yeah.
about Giovanni last week.
Yeah, I imagine there's kind of a weird like I don't know, I tend to think of things in like weird evolutionary survivability things, but it does like it gives you a reason to unify both groups, a reason to
Yeah.
unify.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And, that's actually one of the main arguments of my book is that vendettas are about like solidarity and unification. And like the real enemy, it was really clear, even though these families, several of the families I talk about were fighting vendettas for, I don't know, decades, if not the entire century. Their real enemy was the Duke of Ferrara. He was supposed to be their, like, who was technically their sovereign. Like, he was their enemy. They may have been stabbing each other periodically or
Like,
assassinating each other in
the way you're
churches.
putting that, did they know he was their
Oh,
enemy?
yeah.
Okay,
No,
so
they're very,
they didn't
yeah,
like these people, but they also really didn't like him.
they really didn't like him. I
Was
mean,
there
yeah.
manufactured connections that were implied to like, oh well, those guys, we want to kill them because not only did they do this thing to us, but they work with this dude and this is how,
I suspect there's probably part of that, but here's
like
the really
propaganda.
interesting part. Yeah, I mean, I suspect there's probably part of that, but here's the really interesting part. So, one of the things I talk about and I trace is that these same men and women who are practicing vendettas were also on the government together.
Hmm.
And you can actually trace year by year, like somebody who were in an active vendetta, like someone who had been stabbed or shot or something like that, would be sitting on the town council during the same trimester or
Mhm.
shortly thereafter. So there was almost a one-to-one correspondence. Like during the same time, they were all sitting around the same table doing boring government stuff. And then, periodically just like, okay, now it's our turn, sorry.
Right.
We got you in church this week, your time's coming up.
Like I imagine it's just an accepted sort of social element. Like,
Sure.
yeah, we all have to work together, but eventually, one of us is going to do a thing because we have to.
Yeah, yeah. And you do get that sense is there like, there's kind of this level of acceptable loss, right?
Hmm.
Like some people were gonna, be victims of this, large overall practice, but overall it was, still kind of like keeping a homeostasis in place that was at least beneficial for like the civic life, like the life of the city. And the violence was somewhat disruptive, but not as disruptive as you would think, right? And it was really interesting for me. Like one of the sources I looked at eventually was the records of the council, like the town council. Insanely boring. Like you would never know that these
Hmm.
people were like in mortal enmity with one another for like basically the entirety of the 16th century. You're like, okay, so there was a stabbing, and then they all went back to work together and talked
Hmm.
about bread prices, basically. So
So let's talk about that too. I assume this is a very, I'm trying to think, insular way that this manifests. Like I'm going to go kill that guy, and they figure everything out, and then they just go and do it, as
yeah,
opposed to like dealing with like non-combatants. It's like
yeah.
it's not like something that's spilling out into the street, and the guy over there who's the butcher and the baker and all those guys are also running chants. So for the peasantry,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
for
yeah.
those guys, like it was just, this is a thing that those guys do over there, and we might hear about it, but it's not like spilling out into the streets, and there's not guys with daggers. Commercial time. In this conversation, actually, we ended up talking about a Stoneburner record I did. It's digital only, called Beauty is Terror, which came kind of based on Donna Tartt's fantastic novel, The Secret History, which you absolutely should read. It's amazing. But the entire record is built on this idea of exploring how we just deal with excess, and the many ways through addiction or love or sex or whatever. It's all about excess and emotional turmoil. It is a pretty diverse record, going from dance stuff to just me and a piano for a song called London, which is one of my favorites, to very, very noisy and industrial things. So I will tag some of the videos onto the end of this interview, and you can check that stuff out. Right now, the Stoneburner site's in between things, but you can find all that at stoneburnerofficial.bandcamp.com, on the Ego Likeness YouTube channel, which I'm pretty sure you can just look up as Ego Likeness YouTube. I honestly don't remember the address for it. So, yeah, but check it out. It's good stuff.
Yeah. So most vendetta killings were very public in nature, and they took place in like piazza or churches. Churches are very popular, probably because that's where you have a guarantee, like your enemy's going to be at
Yeah,
church.
there.
And
Yeah,
or
sound
piazza
upon that.
during, yeah, Easter was like that's the popular time to kill your enemy. Really?
I know,
We
I believe
found
it, but it's also
this.
one of those things like, well, if you know that's going to happen,
Yeah.
maybe just don't go.
I know, like coming up, guys. It's Easter. Like, just beware if you have enemies. But no, Easter was really, really popular, and carnival season. I mean, but yeah, Easter was the time. Easter was the time to go after your enemies. But they were very, very ritual. Like, I mean, you have these extensive kind of ritual accounts of people being approached. They're raising the host. The priest is raising the host, and then their assassin, creeps up on him and stabs him 27 times, and then just leaves through the door. And that's, in that case, these vendetta killings are very formulaic, almost like a church ritual, like, a feast day ritual.
Is it formulaic to the point that you see it happen and accept it? Or like, because I mean, if you think about it from more modern setting, if something like that were to happen, you got everybody else there. You'd see
Right.
it just evolving into chaos, or trying to get the guy.
It's really hard to figure out and I wish I had more. Unfortunately, we just don't have like accounts of like, what the baker thought of all this, like these
Right.
crazy noblemen. Once again, there's a stabbing among, like these guys, they
Mhm.
just went stabbing one another. We don't have a ton of that, but we do know that they, in some cases, kind of cooperated or just refused to like report. So there were, there are letters like, from governmental officials that talk about like, yeah, we know this happened. Everyone has been talking about it, but everyone refuses to give any witness testimony. Like,
Mhm.
whether that was fear or just like, we're just not going to disrupt things too much. We
Yeah, it's
know,
like,
like,
it's your problem.
yeah, they stab each other once every 3 years. It's not a
Mhm.
big deal, right? So it's hard to know, but they didn't kill non-combatants. That was really clear. There was usually just one or two targets. You may have a melee, but it was, it seemed very kind of like planned almost, like, kind of a
Right.
ritual encounter. But for the most part, like, it's just not, the average person on the street is just witnessing it. Like, they're just seeing it happen. They're not, nobody's, I'm sure there are probably cases out there, of like accidental problems, but you just don't see it a lot. Excuse me. The only case that I have is the bombing. So there is part of this vendetta. There were one of the Fontana family who was sent into exile went to an artisan in 1562, and I think he just thought he would get creative with getting back at his enemies, getting back at the Belloncini, and he had the artisan construct letter bombs.
Hmm.
And so these letter bombs were designed. They looked like presents, actually, or designed to be like presents, like the descriptions.
Hmm.
We have lots of descriptions of these letter bombs. They're painted, right? They're painted and tied with a string and had like a letter address. So naturally, if you receive one of these, you think, "Oh, cool! Someone sent me a present." So, but when you open the letter bomb, it triggered a mechanism, like a pulley mechanism, and triggered the gunpowder, and it would explode in your face.
Right.
And so he sent these very ritualistically on the same hour and the same day to several of the Belloncini family across northern Italy, and killed a bunch of people, and in fact killed a couple women because these packages were delivered
Right.
these people at the dinner hour,
Hmm.
and there just happened to be people like sitting next to them at the table. But that's kind of an exceptional case. I mean, it's exceptional in a lot of different ways, but that's an exceptional case of like kind of what we would consider non-combatants being killed in vendetta killings.
Um, so, so let's say that I do something like that. I come up with this really cool new method to kill
Whole
someone.
new method of killing your enemies.
Is there a reward within the family that, like, do you suddenly get more clout? Do you get
A really good question.
whatever?
It's hard to say. So most of the people who actually committed the crimes or, I guess did the stabbings or assassinations themselves were younger sons.
Mhm.
So that makes sense. They hadn't actually assumed, their kind of like political office like they
Right.
were expected to, or hadn't, taken orders with the church or whatever was going to happen later on. And so they could go into exile really quickly or readily,
Right.
and it just wouldn't affect anything. Like the family business would keep, moving onwards. And that's really what happened with most of these families is they choose a younger son to carry out the assassination or the fight, and then the younger son would just go into exile. And he would stay away for however many years, get a pardon, let things calm down, and then just come back. And in a lot of cases, he would come back and he'd be like, "Okay, it's now my turn to take up the family business." My nephew or younger nephew or my son, now it's your turn to carry out some of these assassinations. So you do have that kind of sort of it's that younger son's turn to kind of carry on this particular family like obligation or burden. Um, but I mean, again, it was a very kind of complex, organized system where you could tell like these families just kind of considered it part, for lack of a better term, part of the family business,
Mhm.
right? Like that's just so we're lawyers and we have a great law practice going on. We're advisors to the Duke, and we're going to be serve as senators of Rome for a couple of years. Also, we have this vendetta ongoing with this other family, but that's just what one does, right? So yeah, that's just part of it. The other interesting piece of this, is that most of the men, at least in the city that I studied for this book, were lawyers. So they were actually legally trained. So they couldn't actually claim that they didn't understand the law because they wrote the law and they helped, they were supposed to help enforce it. And so because of that, they were also really good at coming up with like loopholes sort of ahead of time, like, okay, there is this little like crack in this law about doing this. Okay, so we're going to exploit this in order to kind of keep this sort of process going.
Um, so you mentioned the bombs, and
Mhm.
were there other in my head? I must have picked it up from somewhere or another, but there's the trope of somebody climbing in and above them and dropping the poison down the string. Um, did it ever get that interesting and dramatic, or
I mean, they're pretty dramatic. poison is never used in vendettas. So
Really?
poison, yeah, no, poison
Really?
is, they considered it, I mean, a lot of it, at least in at least in some of the sources describe it as a woman's weapon.
Hmm.
So, I mean, all of these are pre-planned,
Mhm.
very public events, right? Everyone knew,
So that's almost part of it is the whole
yeah,
is making sure that people see it and
yeah. You want people to see it. You want to know how and why and by whom they were killed,
Mhm.
right? Everyone knew that information. There was no secrecy involved. In fact, like the bomber, the Unabomber, early modern Unabomber, part of the backlash against him was because he was semi-secretive
Right.
about, what he was doing. So,
Um, I just picture somebody kind of like getting stabbed in a church, and then like, right up before he does that, just sticks a big flag on. He's like, "Ha ha!
yeah. I mean, yeah.
Punch in a way."
That's not too far off the mark.
So,
Yeah.
you have this thing that's been going on for X number of years, right?
Mhm.
Is there an actual end goal, like, or is it just we just want to keep killing each other because it gives us something to do?
That is a really good question. So you really start to see vendetta dying off around 1700.
Mhm.
And you start to see vendetta dying off around 1700 for a number of reasons. But I think one of the primary reasons is in Italy, like governments just started to change, right? I mean, they started to change everywhere in, 1700, the 18th century. But there was, the acceleration of dramatic change in Italy. And so these families no longer had the same sort of place and the same, like their systems that kind of kept this weird homeostasis ongoing were just starting to crumble. And so you can sort of look at vendetta as having like what seems to us a very dysfunctional function, but for them was actually, had a variety of complex functions. It just didn't have the same functional resonance right around 1700 or 1720 that it had before, just for a variety of different reasons. So, I mean, I think part of it, I think one of the primary reasons families kept up with it for as long as they did, and we have records of vendettas dating back to the 13th century on to like the 17th century, 18th century. Um, I think one of the reasons is because families were really obsessed with keeping justice amongst themselves, right? Because vendetta in the very real way is just about like justice. It's not what we think of as justice, but it's still a form of justice, right? Right around 1800, 1700 is really when you start to see the development of what we think of as the modern justice system. So as the modern justice system like was sort of developing and, the criminal courts as we think of today are being put into place, and prisons are being like, and there are a bunch of people who are developing new theories about justice and, crime and, criminal punishment. That's really when you start to see vendetta dropping off because, the justice system, even, the informal justice of vendetta just wasn't functioning in the same way anymore.
So, when you talk about different ideas about justice, do you mean like
Mhm.
incarceration versus, say, stabbing?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like I think when I think motive is weird, right? I mean, if you look at any criminal cases prior to 1800, motive is weird. Um, and you don't always see motives. Like people don't talk about motive in the same way. They're not like, oh, he was angry or, I mean, sometimes they do, but not quite in the same way. I think that when I think about justice, I think that, the criminal justice system, really kind of got the modern criminal justice system and criminal courts really got started in like, I don't know, 1300 or so in many places, particularly in Italy. But they were sort of parallel. Like they weren't as concerned about like punishment per se. They were just concerned with social regulation. So even if you committed a homicide, or in some cases, not all cases, if you were in a vendetta or something like this, the way to stop a criminal prosecution was to just sign a peace agreement or pay a fine. And that was the justice system for a very, very long period of time. Like they didn't really have, I mean, in Venice, you start to see, the prison a little bit earlier. But for the most part, like you could stop a criminal case or a criminal proceeding unless they were really determined to like send you to the gallows or, cut off your head. You could, in many cases, just stop a criminal proceeding by signing a peace agreement. And so that's kind of a system where like that's a form of like just making sure that there's an equilibrium as opposed to like, okay, the state is responsible for like order and making sure everyone obeys, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I don't know if this necessarily is directly related, but it's related to the justice system. Um, at what point, like, we have a very, man, it seems like it's been in place for a while, so I'm going to assume that goes back that far. We have a very kind of, for establishing guilt, we have like a kind of
Mhm.
specific set of requirements to do that.
Yeah.
And you made a comment about how, well, like I was angry. And so that was kind of their thing. But
Mhm.
do you know at what point that came into being, or was it just sort of an evolutionary sort of thing that just sort of they kind of figured?
No, I mean, we can go pretty far back with like the inquisitorial procedure, where like there's a denunciation or, someone's like, okay, I saw, Brad the other day. I saw him like, kick that child, right? Who, is now like broke their arm or whatever. So you could denounce somebody or
Mhm.
somebody could witness it, and be like, okay, so we saw this homicide and, we're going to report it because, this, it needs to be reported and there's a mechanism to,
Right,
sort of like, because at the end of the day, if you commit a homicide, it disrupts like kind of the social order, right?
right.
And so they weren't as concerned about guilt per se in the same way that we
It's
are.
just maintaining.
It's just maintaining equilibrium, right? Like as long as things were restored relatively okay, where, like
Oh, like,
the,
oh, it's cool. We're all cool. We're fine.
yeah, we're cool, or at least we're cool for, like the next 2 months.
Right,
We can just kind of keep the equilibrium going. So, that's really part of the process, not only of vendettas, but like the criminal justice system or, like during this period in general is like it's way more concerned with maintaining social equilibrium, however that whatever form that takes, versus, like putting someone in jail or, executing them. So that's really not the end goal per
it's
se.
almost like a ritualized sacrifice for,
Yes, in some
for
cases, yeah, yeah.
maintaining. It's like we're, you know, as a way to kind of let off steam and say, like, okay, we know everybody gets hot-headed, so we're just going to decide that we don't like you guys and you don't like us. But instead of like actually like trying to really fuck you guys up, we're just going to sacrifice, one of our people every
Yeah.
few years, and that way we can all get along in the day-to-day thing.
Yeah, yeah. And there's been a lot of really excellent research done on that, not just as violence as kind of a safety valve, like it's just, okay, there's a level of acceptable violence that we'll tolerate just because it keeps things kind of like coming along.
Mhm.
But also, other sort of functions like carnival. I mean, carnival, you know, I mean, the carnival today is really tame compared to carnival, in the medieval and early modern period, and that was really everyone's time to like, do crazy stuff, like put on
Look like old
masks,
Dionysian
you
off.
know, like, I don't know, attend orgies or whatever,
Mhm.
like it was everyone's sort of like, way of sort of releasing steam. So there has been a lot of excellent research that says, that this was, things like, sometimes killings or other there were these things that serve this function to kind of like just maintain things.
Right. There's this fantastic book by Donna Tartt uh, called The Secret History.
I haven't read that.
Oh
It's
my!
been on my list.
I wrote a record based on it. Or at least,
Oh, really?
yeah, I did this record called "Beauty Is Terror,"
Hmm.
and
I did not realize that was. Oh, are you kidding? Okay, that's amazing.
um, and yeah, there's this one specific thing, and I'm not going to quote it at all correctly, but they're talking about the Maenads and like basically just talking about the need to have these manufactured bacchanal, like these manufactured valves for releasing
Yeah, yeah.
societal pressure.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, Um, so was this like something that was kind of limited to Italy, or is it just that's your field of focus and this was going on in Greece and in the region, or like did it just stop at the edge?
Excellent question. So the when I say vendetta, I think that's a very specifically an Italian term, right? Um, and but the feud itself is all over Europe
Right.
during this period. So I think in Italy it had its own sort of like Italian inflection, just like in France it would have its own sort of French, tenor
Right.
to it.
Well, like I mean, the way you're talking about it, so to the point that it's almost ritualized.
Yeah, absolutely, very ritualized. In Italy, just because of the way the Protestant Revolution impacted Italy differently than it did other places. Like, that's where you see a lot of like almost, this sort of these echoes of sacred ritual in some of these killings, right? Because, Italy just very much retained,
Right. I
that
mean,
high Catholic feel to it.
right.
I mean, but in France, you have some really interesting stuff going on with feuds, and the French nobility were also notorious for feuding, and there's some really excellent work out there. Some scholars who've done some work on this. Like they were also doing it, but it's at certain times it took on some of the characteristics of the wars of religion. So like the fights between the Catholics and the Protestants kind of like crept into that, and same with Germany. I mean, Germany had feuding. Feuding went on in Germany, pretty much, I don't know, definitely into the 16th or 17th century. And, some of my colleagues are currently doing really excellent research, kind of tracing the feud, in the 16th and 17th century. So it certainly wasn't confined to Italy, but I think that there are regional inflections to the practice for sure.
A really cool way to put reflections. I like that. Yeah, I think it's interesting because in my head, and maybe it's because I've read a lot of Echo and a lot of the Irish stuff. Uh,
Mm.
there's, and maybe it has to do with, well, I guess it's France. As I say, the Three Musketeers, but the church is such a almost like yeah, it exists and does its thing, but it's also this underlying force of chaos,
Yeah, absolutely.
like stirring things up, and or how people relate to the church. But so it's interesting that this was almost completely removed from it. Like,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, you know, that's one of the interesting things about, studying early modern European history is, there are so many sort of like, you know, idiosyncrasies. I
mhm,
mean, there's universal things, but there are also, idiosyncrasies, like how a feud could play out, or just, how a church service could play out could vary widely between like Austria and, Naples, right?
mhm.
And so, kind of figure out like where those sort of how that sort of happens is really interesting. I mean, my eventual hope is there are enough people doing work on like the feud in general right now. I mean, it's just become a really, I don't know, hot topic. I mean, and I could speculate why we're all interested
Right.
right now. I mean, I think that there are reasons. I think that,
Strangely, a lot of work on Civil War right
yeah,
now.
I know, right?
Uh,
Crazy, really, really crazy. Yeah, and how violence relates to like politics.
mhm,
Strange, yeah.
mhm.
Strange that there are a lot of people interested in that right now. Right. So, my hope is that, I mean, we're hoping to like, basically put together like a working group so we can compare each other's data and see if like what are the commonalities, what are the differences. I mean, and to be fair, research of violence, I mean, have really been doing, and vendetta is obviously part of the spectrum. Research of violence have been doing some really excellent work, I think, in the last, 20 years,
Mhm.
saying, okay, here are the points in time when violence really gets bad, and, here are the factors behind it. And some of what, the researchers have come up with would surprise me and would probably surprise most people because it's not what you'd necessarily think.
Such as,
So Randolph Roth, and I have been recommending this book to just about everyone I know because I think it's interesting reading for Americans right now. He wrote this book in 2011 called American Homicide. And what he found after looking at, basically homicide from the pre-revolutionary period on, to like post-Civil War era, is that it doesn't have anything to do with like Americans wanting to like brawl, like they're not just feeling particularly ornery.
Right.
It doesn't have really much to do with like the frontier per se, right? Or like, but what it does have to do with is what he frames as a lack of social trust.
Hmm.
So when Americans trust each other less and they trust their government less, the rates of violence spike dramatically. So we and other researchers have actually found this pattern in other places, like the government's just not effectively keeping this equilibrium going, or like something has happened to like kind of erode like the sort of trust in one's neighbors, and that's when you start to see violence really rise dramatically.
But it makes sense if you kind of like pull back from the whole like we're human thinking things and go back to like, oh hey, we're bonobos. Then you kind of like, okay, it makes perfect sense. If your environment is questionable, then you're going to be much more like on edge.
Trigger happy, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so did was there any say like spillover? Because if you're talking like 1700s, that means the New World is active and there's people
Mhm.
going there. Was there spillover into the New World?
I think it's a really good question. I think one of the things that Randolph Roth looked at in his book that kind of surprised me is, the feuding culture, you're talking about feuds or vendettas. I mean, Scotland was really bad, so was Ireland.
Oh yeah, yeah, of course.
Yeah, really, really bad. It wasn't really the Scottish and the Irish. They weren't like kind of bringing that with them per se as other people. It's kind of speculated like, okay, they brought with them feuding cultures, just kind of like the same, like the reason we have the mafia has nothing to do with the fact that Italians practice vendetta, right? So yeah, they're two separate kind of things. So I mean, I think that there was some spillover, but the spillover or feuds like the Hatfields and the McCoys had more to do with like the lack of policing,
Right.
or the lack of like a justice system that could like mediate their disputes than it had to do with like, the McCoys were Scottish extraction.
Right. Yeah. Well, and also I think that so when you think about vendetta and you think about I imagine that I would actually bet that there is a minimum sized family
Mhm.
that you would need in order to pull that off.
100%. Yeah, 100%. And you need money, actually,
Right.
and you
Yeah.
need political influence, and you need networks. I mean, you need a lot of things.
In
And
order
that,
for it to work, you really have to be plugged into society
yeah,
as a whole.
absolutely.
It's not, which is going to be different than say, that guy took my cow.
Yeah, right, exactly. I mean, and this is kind of a departure from the medieval period because you do see the feuds like
Mhm.
like Anglo-Saxon England about cow stealing. I mean, that is definitely something you see. But yeah, I mean, these families
Not
were
organized in
well,
the same way, I guess is kind
yeah,
of.
no, not at all. But like the laws were different too. Like we really didn't have the court system per se. So, like of course people went to fight over, their cows. I mean, that made perfect sense in the logic of that system.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean you need a lot of resources. I mean, and that's the distinctive things about these families. These are not like, you don't have a vendetta unless you're politically influential.
Mhm. Did you have resources? So did these feuds manifest in ways that required resources like I can't even think of one, but like fucking with somebody else's business or
Oh yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting, and this is one of the interesting. It's interesting. The one of the things that the rulers tried to, various polities in Italy started to try to do. They recognized the system, and in fact, in some cases, like the Medici, their families had sort of tacitly been part of the system.
Mhm.
Is they tried to find ways to control these feuds through the law. Okay, so they would pass laws and they would say homicide. I mean, homicide everywhere was always, like illegal, right?
Mhm.
There were criminal penalties to homicide, but they would pass laws like, for example, if you broke a peace agreement, and vendetta by nature is breaking a
Mhm.
peace agreement. they would fine you and confiscate a part of your like your estate.
Mhm.
So let's say you've got like three palazzi and a bunch of land in the countryside and maybe a mill or here whatever. They would threaten to confiscate.
But you'd have to work that into your calculations of the value.
Absolutely.
Like, is this guy worth losing
Yeah,
vineyard?
exactly. And so the families got really clever about it, though, is they started to, at a certain point, they started to come up with these really complicated property transactions where you can almost trace in several cases, you can trace when a vendetta killing is about to happen
Mhm.
by the fact that the families start to change their wills.
Mhm.
So you've got these weird sort of embezzlement clauses in the wills that sort of skirt the law somewhat and like leave the properties in ways that the officials could not actually confiscate it.
Right. That's fascinating. That's really interesting. Um, Let me see if I have anything else that I was specifically thinking about. Poisoned, gold, nuns. Do you know like what the first like official vendetta record was? Of, like the first
That's a really good question.
going back to you talking about 1300s. So
So one of the earliest, I don't know if this is the first, you actually start to see a bunch of town chronicles being written in like the 12th century. 13th century is 13th century, so right around 1220 or so. The Chronicle of Villani is one of the first like famous vendetta narratives, where like there was apparently a marriage agreement between one family, and then they broke the marriage agreement, and as a result of breaking the marriage agreement, a
that would
vendetta
be
broke
great,
out.
great offense.
Yeah, and it was actually part of a big part of the kind of like civic myth of Florence. Like this vendetta was kind of embedded into the civic myth of Florence, and kind of an explanation of why they needed a certain governmental system. I mean, there's a lot of propaganda there, but that's one of the earliest I can think of. But I'm sure there are more out there. I mean, if I collected every piece of documentary evidence or narrative evidence on vendetta, I would never get away from this topic ever,
Right.
ever. I'm
Well,
not like opposed to that per se,
well, that
but
actually brings up a good question. Is so now that you have clearly done this to death. Where do you want to go? What's the? Do you have a?
I do. I have a next book project. So, and I have a digital project that I'm working on. I have actually several digital projects. So I'm actually working with my colleagues who are working on Feud or similar type to put together a collective like research project. Like we're collaboratively trying to figure out ways to like bring our data together, examine it, see what the patterns are, just to see. This isn't just about feuding. It's just about, I mean, it's also about violence in general because most of the current research on violence that talks about like the homicide rates is
Mhm.
actually based on really small data sets, like
Mhm.
really small data sets. So we're trying to get bigger data sets so we can get a better picture, of just violence in general. So that's one of the projects that I'm working on. Hoping to find funding soon so we can put together a database. The eventual vision is to get funding to put together a database, and then everyone I know can like go and just play around with it, look at the data, like visualize it, map it, do whatever you want with it.
Mhm.
Just, explore, right? If that's your thing, if you're interested in violence, you can explore violence and, like, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of interesting material out there.
Mhm.
So that's one of my goals. I've been working on that for a while and, continuing to work on that. My next book project is on gender and crime in a comparative history of gender and crime in Venice and Bologna, which are two kind of distinct polities, but there's a lot of interesting stuff that I kind of found working on this vendetta book. Because I was trying to find vendettas elsewhere. That's kind of how it got started, and I found a ton of them. And I was like, I'm not going to put this in the book. That will be a project, some other project. But I just found a lot of really interesting material on gender. Like at the beginning of this, exploration, I ran across this case. This poor woman was assassinated. She was killed. and her body was found. And when they started interviewing the witnesses, um, they the witnesses were all talking about like how she had this male best friend, and she had this male best friend that she hung out with all the time. Like they were always seen together, like basically partying in public, which is how it's described. um, and they were not the same age, so there was clearly, I mean, everyone agreed there was nothing sexual going on between the two of them. And he just liked her. She kind of treated him. He treated her like a mother, and they're friends. And so, like, one day she was found dead, and he was the suspect. And he was the suspect because she was apparently a really mean person. She was always like yelling at her neighbors. She was always like offending people in the street. And like she also had a gun, like, which is kind of unusual for a woman. At least it's one of it so far. It's one of the few cases I found of a woman possessing a gun. She would carry her gun around and just like wave it at people, which is just as illegal in like 1578 Verona as it is today, right? And so people just didn't like her. But it turns out that her male best friend, was a suspect because one day she was usually pretty nice with him, but one day she started insulting his manhood, and like he killed her apparently, like he beat her to death. And after I ran across that case, it was like there was a lot of really interesting gender stuff going on here. Like, can I find other interesting cases? And I did. I found a lot of really crazy stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the next book is gender and crime in the courts. Because we
And so
just don't know much about women. We don't know much about women, how they interact with the courts. We don't know much about women criminals. We don't know how much about how gender performance kind of like, we have this kind of idea that, early moderns were hyper masculine and, they're performing masculinity, but that may not actually be the case from what I'm seeing in the criminal courts.
yeah, I mean, there is that kind of like historic trope of the woman that's behind the scenes or
Right.
does the thing.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
obviously, I'm sure that must have come from somewhere. I mean, in addition to just being, you know, I think a good thing to kind of remind people that women are involved with daily lives and do everything. But I mean, I think the whole matriarch archetype
Yeah.
for that is pretty legit. Um, Hell, even down to, and this is fiction, but the whole 300 thing where, got
Yeah.
like, well, can I
Yes.
go ahead and do that? Yes, go
Yeah, yeah. You get those Spartans back.
ahead.
Um, yeah. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. There's just a lot. I mean, there's just a lot of interesting material. I
Hmm.
found a lot of stuff on nuns. Like, I can't get away from the nuns. So, like,
Some violence?
well, yeah, or just, I don't know, like, yeah, violence taking place in convents,
Hmm.
convents being just sort of like accused of crimes taking place in convents.
I mean, it seems like
Nun-
it'd be a great place to kind of
yeah, yeah,
hide
yeah.
or
Yeah, I mean, there was at least one case in one of the vendettas I was studying for the first book. Like they were hiding guns, they were
hmm,
hiding stockpiles of weapons in the convents because they knew they would not be searched.
right.
Perfectly logical, which sounds very like I think I read actually where there was a case where there was a nun, a modern day nun who was doing something similar for the mob. Anyway, so yeah, I mean, I just don't know. I haven't been able to like put my finger on precisely what's going on because there is a little bit of coyness when they talk about the convents, like what's going on. Like they'll say, yeah, this nun and a priest were caught together, you know, for the 15th time, but they don't. How they talk about it is something that I'm still trying to kind of like wrap my head around because there's supposed to be a certain amount of circumspection. So honestly, what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to like look at the ecclesiastical records.
Hmm. That one of my very favorite parts about like, because I'll give myself assignments to like write a record or do some artwork or whatever based on a specific idea.
I'm the same. I always give myself assignments.
Well, and
Yeah.
that's kind of what made me think about it because, like, that's the fun part. Like making, I make stuff. That's not the hard part. Or the not even necessarily the interesting part, but having those constraints.
Yeah.
Um, and then you start to discover what the thing wants to be, and you know, those are the places where the surprises and the cool. And so I can imagine it just, and you're dealing with the real world as opposed to kind of the manufactured world, but I'm sure that must be just a great deal of fun.
Oh, it's a blast. I mean, I'm a big believer in serendipity. Like, I mean, my entire career has been just randomly coming across stuff, and following trails. And it's the same in the archives. It's one of the things I love about what I do is, I can go in the archives and be like, there's something weird going on here. I'm probably going to be spending the next 2 years like banging my head up against the wall, looking at a bunch of documents, figuring out what that is. But there is something going on weird here, and that's a cool thing. And that's the thing I'm trying to figure out with the convents is like. The weird part is technically the criminal records I'm looking at are secular, and nuns and monks are not supposed to be in secular courts.
Right.
So I'm like,
What
how
are
did
they
this
doing?
happen? Yeah, how does this
Yeah.
happen? How did they get there? But that's where they're showing up. I'm like, hmm. So there's something happening there with, yeah, there's something interesting happening there. I just don't know what yet.
I love the sense of a pattern that you'll find with certain projects or whatever. I did something once a bunch of years ago. It was the thing that ended up making all of this crap was getting just a few pieces of gear and starting to all of a sudden kind of see this, oh, I could make this happen and do this. And
Yeah.
it's like you see the hint of this pattern underneath things. And so it's always, yeah, I just love that kind of thing, and I think that's a great, part of all of this is that what results in those passions is that sense of like, yeah, yeah, gimme, let's find it, let's find this thing together and figure out where we're going with it, which is just cool.
Yeah. No, that's the best part. I mean, that's why I'm lucky. I get to like explore those. I get to like explore my obsessions, right? Like I get to go to the archives and spend hours and hours just pouring through old documents, like trying to follow an intuition or a hunch because I'm obsessed. And
Mhm.
that's pretty freaking awesome. I'm super lucky.
Yeah, when I started, I guess I've been doing this for about a month now, and I was a few episodes in, and one point I was just thinking just about how beneficial to it as just as an individual when you have these things, and how there are people out there that don't, and there are people out there that are just going through their lives, and so that's again part of the impetus for this is maybe like they'll see why it's beneficial and start figuring out, like looking at the things they enjoy and start feeling like, what can I get really obsessed about to the point that it annoys everybody else?
Well,
Yeah.
I followed, I was really happy that you reached out to me because I kind of followed your thread. I saw because we're friends on Facebook. I saw
Oh,
you
okay.
post about it. I was like, should I volunteer? I was like, no one wants to hear from a historian. But then Nathan, who was like one of my best friends and biggest cheerleaders, obviously passed my name along. But, like I thought about, I kind of watched people's response to it. People are like, well, maybe. And I'm like, look, like that's what makes life cool. Like if you want to obsessively study, like, I don't know, like horse racing, for like 2 months, go for it. Like
Right.
whatever kind of keeps you like, it doesn't have to like make money. It doesn't have to like be, like lauded or appreciated by other people. I
It
mean, some
makes you
people
happy,
really
it makes
know.
you
Yeah,
happy. And again, it's
exactly.
that collection of knowledge
Yeah, yeah,
that
yeah.
is so cool. Um, yeah, it's just so interesting how that whole thing has played out. Because there have been a few people where I know they thought that it wasn't something that'd be interesting, but I'm like, yeah, absolutely. And I've got a rule that I'm doing now, which is if I don't know anything about it at all, then I definitely have to do it. You
That's
know,
awesome. That's great. I'm like super excited. Like when you release this, I'm like thrilled to like not only be part of this, but to like watch the other episodes and hear what people said because like it's just great. I mean, how cool is it to listen to somebody talk about like what they're passionate about, like what they're into?
right? Yeah,
That's
no.
fantastic.
I've tried, it's funny, like I've had to balance it out because it's so easy. Like artists and musicians, that's easy. I can get them
Yeah,
in the loop.
yeah,
And the
yeah,
problem with that is that we tend to have similar conversations.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Um, so like I've probably got more musicians on this one than I should, but at certain points, like, specific people like became available and it's like, oh,
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm excited about that too because I mean, as someone who's
Mhm.
musically trained, I love hearing what musicians have to say about, like what drives them in creating music or
Mhm.
playing music. So Yeah, that's exciting too. But
Like the
yeah,
other night, I had a professor of comic books. Like he's an English professor, but he's specifically a, I get doctor. I don't know whatever it is on comic book history and
yeah,
how it
yeah.
works. I'm trying to think of some of the like I've done so many of these at this point that's trying to like just a guy who built his own car. I
Yeah.
don't think about cars, but he loves it, and so like getting into all of like the details and stuff like that was very cool. Or yeah, it's been a really fascinating thing. I'm actually going to drop my uncle a line because
Oh,
he's the actual real cowboy. Like
oh, fantastic.
yeah, like
That'll be
he had
awesome.
a horse vet thing that he did in Napa for 1,000 years, and now he lives out in like Colorado on some massive, and he just has horses, and that's what he does.
It's
You know,
fantastic.
so
Yeah, I'd love to hear about that. I mean,
right.
yeah, I mean, I think just it's cool to be curious, and just hear about other people's. I will never be a cowboy or
Right.
cowgirl, right? But I want to hear what that's like. And I mean, that's why I read books or watch YouTube videos or listen to podcasts, right? Because I want to hear about other worlds, and
That's one of my
other
big
lives.
things with art students. I'm like, look, your job is to take everything that you get in and then filter it through your thing and then put it back out. And all you get is you. I live a world away from reality. I've been married for 25 years. I live in the woods,
Yeah,
and I don't do out like unless somebody's paying me. So like I'm always just like you need to read as much as you can so you can get these lives and get that information because you never know what when you're trying to put something together when you're like, oh, I can use this part of this life here and this part of this
yeah,
life here.
yeah, yeah,
This
absolutely.
thing I'm doing sound more real or feel more real.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. And like, yeah, I mean, if you want to become a better writer, you read all
Mhm.
sorts of writing. If you want to become a better artist, you expose yourself, But I think the same is true. Like you talk about Umberto Eco a lot, who's
Mhm.
like honestly one of my favorite people on the planet.
Mhm.
Like I've always said I want to be Umberto Eco when I grow up. I'm probably about 20 years away from that. Like he was just but he was like an omnivore. Like he read and like he just exposed himself to everything and he wrote about everything and he had that column in like La Repubblica for I don't know however long he had, which were just some of the most fascinating columns to read.
Mhm.
Like I would go and buy La Repubblica when I lived in Italy, like just so I could read his column.
Mhm.
And it was just, like he just. Have you ever seen that picture with him surrounded by all of his books? Like books are
No,
practically falling down.
yeah.
He's literally surrounded by stacks of books, and you're like, he actually is living in Borges' like library.
Well, and what's cool with his, when you go back and you read like How to Travel with a Salmon and stuff like that, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So one of my big things about art in general is that if you okay, people get mad at me when I say this, but I'm like, H.R. Giger is a hack, or was a hack, and I'll tell you why. Here's my argument for that: because he found one trick,
Mhm.
and that's all he did.
I can see that.
He
Yeah,
didn't
yeah, I
like
can see
he
that.
changed
Yeah,
mediums occasionally, like
yeah, yeah,
but basically what he was doing was the same throughout his entire career.
yeah, yeah. I can see
Versus
that. You're right.
like Picasso, right? Who
Right.
had, he's like his blue period, and then
Yeah, a
he
bunch of periods. Right, right, right,
can't
right.
see I can't see this all of a person at the same time. So he created cubism, and then he did all these other different, like where he basically set these goals out to try and solve problems.
Right, right, right,
Which
right.
to me, I think is basically the other way I have of putting it is that if you can only do one thing as an artist, it's a trick.
Yeah.
But if you can make a choice to do that or some other thing, then you're actually making a choice to modify your instinct to create different things.
Yeah, 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 absolutely. I mean, you learn that when you like, I don't know, like going back to musical training. Like, I mean, I learned all sorts of instruments, or I was encouraged to learn all sorts of instruments because like everyone knew I, was into music just to see if I liked it. And you learn like
A different
WC.
language, like
Yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah. You
like,
just play around until you get to figure out what works for you, right?
when we started doing music, like um, I had this very cool moment where all of a sudden I was like, because all the stuff that I learned in art school, and I think that you tend to think that like as a different thing or whatever, and then all of a sudden I realized like, no, this is all exactly the same thing. Like I have all of these skills it's like I know how to articulate where I want to go. I know how to
Sure.
start critique. So like just that right there, helps you kind of go, and I know how to use tools. Like I know it's the big one, but so that really went a long way for figuring that stuff out. But going back to Echo for a second, the thing that I think was amazing about him is and again points to the Picasso thing, where it's like, okay, I knew him because of Foucault's pendulum and
Yeah, yeah.
uh, Name of the Rose. But as you get into these other essays, and you're like, oh, okay, this isn't just a guy who's doing this thing.
No, he was doing everything.
Everything. Like, do you know the
Yeah.
reason he did? He wrote Foucault's pendulum.
I don't remember. I think I'd heard that at some point. But yeah, tell me again because
So, for people who don't know, it deals a lot with essentially secret societies and how like I don't know, the Rosicrucians did all this other, secretly run the Masons and all these other things. But he started because he was a teacher, writing professor, and he would get students repeatedly turning in papers on all of these things.
oh,
And he was like, well,
fascinating.
wouldn't that be interesting if A, if it was true, and B, if they were all connected. So that's kind of how he got to that idea. Um,
That's fascinating because he taught at the University of Bologna, right? And so I wonder what was going on in Bologna in the 1970s.
Well, actually, a lot. And
Yeah,
they get into that because talks a lot about his experiences during the revolutions and things like that were all going
sure,
on,
sure.
like as a kid. So say 20 years before when he was teaching, or 30 years before. So I imagine you have a lot of that going on. You also have everything that's going on out in the world, a lot of the revolutionary ideas.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I would think that that would probably be part of it. And also, I guess because, Italy and that whole area still has such a rich history and fascination with all of that, you know.
Oh,
It's
yeah.
like when you were talking about the nun thing, it got me thinking specifically about that book because, the whole thing begins with them finding just this one little list in
Yeah. I
some
mean,
somewhere in France, so.
sometimes that's what archival research is like, and I disconnected for the first time. Like, like I saw the Name of the Rose with the Sean Connery when I was like really young, and like I was obsessed with like that was the Platonic text, right? It's a Platonic text. It was like Plato's, or was it Socrates?
It was, yes, it was. So the problem was because Bernardo Gui uh,
Mhm.
had a issue with the fact that it had humor in it.
Right, right. And it was supposed to be one of the lost texts, right?
Right.
That
Yeah, it was. Yeah,
right.
and it was specifically a treatise on humor, and he, that wouldn't be part of the church.
No, of course not.
Right. Exactly.
No, no, especially the church that at that time. I mean, it's been a while since I read that book, and now I want to go back and read it. And it's certainly been a while since I've seen the movie. But I do think that that probably that moment of discovery in the library, and then all of the things that surrounded and came after, may have actually had more influence on me wanting to become a historian than I initially thought. Because that like that hope that you find that text or
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah
Absolutely.
that piece of knowledge that's going to change things or make people see things a little bit differently is part of the thrill of discovery.
I haven't done nearly as much writing as Umberto Eco has, but there's always this interesting of finding the balance between the real world and then whatever it is you're writing about.
Yeah,
Umberto, for Name of the Rose, since I guess it's a real monastery or something
it
based on.
is. Yeah, it is. It's in the house above Milan or something like that. But yeah, I know I'm completely botching my Italian geography right now. But yes, it is a real monastery.
So he went there and would walk all the places to see if you could have a conversation
Yeah,
place within that time period. You know,
yeah.
within these X number of steps, can we talk about this and get all of the information out? Like, which is just that's amazing. There's another book called Gospel. It's by a
Mhm.
guy named Wilton Barnhart.
Okay, I don't think I've heard of that. I'm gonna write this
It,
down.
it, it, yeah, it came out, actually for me, it came out right at the perfect time. So it was like, I want to say 1990, 91, something like that.
Okay. And
And
who's the author?
Wilton Barnhart,
Okay.
Barnhardt.
Okay.
And He's gone on to write more just general contemporary fiction, but this specific one is okay. So, uh, crap. Oh, okay. So the Da Vinci Code is to Umberto Eco, like a good meal is to McDonald's, right?
Mhm.
This is like a good meal you bought at a decent restaurant.
Okay.
So it's like it's a similar sort of vibe, not quite the same, but it's basically the story of a I don't remember if he's a monk or not. I don't think so, but like a history teacher, I think actually
Mhm.
tracking down a copy of the Gospel of Matthias, which was a real thing,
Right. Right.
and
Right. Right.
and so he goes on this continent, and it's a big ass book, but this continent spanning journey from monastery to monastery, looking up, trying to track down this Gospel of Matthias because it says something that directly contradicts what the Bible says.
Oh, fascinating.
So
Okay.
yeah, and I I think, and one of the reasons that when I look at Umberto Eco, or even Holy Blood, Holy Grail, or something, it's like you're playing by the rules. It's like okay, yeah, sure, we're making some leaps here, but we're starting with first sources and then
Right.
manufacturing these things. Whereas, like that's the problem with Dan Brown, where it's just like I'm just going to make a bunch of shit up. And
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think this guy mostly played by the rules.
Right. Right. Right.
So
Right.
yeah, like it's right up there, and it's also kind of got there's a bunch of fascinating breakdowns of what stories in the Bible and what they're actually saying. So it's kind of like the good bits version of the Bible.
Fascinating. Okay. I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting.
I
Yeah.
mean, I'm forever sad they haven't made an audiobook of it because I like it these days. That's about the best I'm able to do because I just do so much all the time.
Yeah.
But
Understood.
but
Yeah.
yeah,
Understood.
it's really fucking good.
Okay. All right. I'll try and track that down because that sounds like a
Yeah.
really interesting read.
I mean, I'm
Fantastic.
sure you can get it in digital form, and you can probably just get it on eBay, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. Sure. Yeah, that sounds great. That sounds fantastic. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, it
All
is a
right.
school night for me,
Yeah,
so
yeah, no, it's good. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. But you have a book out now.
I it's coming out in November, November
Okay.
15th. So yeah, November 15th. The title is Civil Blood. Clear reference to Romeo and Juliet. Civil Blood, Vendetta Violence, and the Civic Elites in Early Modern Italy. So yeah, coming out in November. It's being published by Cornell University Press, so it is an academic press, but the advanced reviews say it is readable and that I've done a good job making it readable for
That's
other
well,
people
that's
besides
for an academic.
historians.
Good.
So I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful that it's going to be a really good read. So
Excellent. Good. Well, I'm sure it will be. And I'll definitely. God, I sound like a talk show, so I'll definitely get it. Um, but no, that's fantastic. Congratulations on seeing the whole thing. I mean, it's such a monumental project to actually
thank
like
you.
get it from you know finding this one little thing to actually fruition. It's pretty remarkable. So,
Yeah, no, thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm really proud of it.
and
I'm
you're at
very
George
proud of it.
Mason.
I'm what?
You're George Mason University.
Yeah, I'm George Mason. I'm George Mason.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah, George Mason. So yeah, probably be there for a while, fortunately. So yeah, but yeah, I'm George Mason. I will be giving actually a talk probably in DC at Profs and Pints and sometimes in May on like the history of revenge. If anybody sees this and is like, hey, I want to go have a beer and listen to her talk about revenge.
Okay.
So yeah, I have a couple other opportunities I can pass along too, like
Yeah.
that.
If you so when this is all, I'm hoping. I think we'll do the first week in April, and that's going to be my cutoff for recording these.
Okay, cool.
Um, so send me anything that you want me to include in the text
Awesome.
for it.
Okay, I can
Um,
do that. Yeah, I've got pictures. If you want pictures.
yeah, I can tag them onto the end of
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I've got pictures. I've got like archival pictures. I mean, like a diagram of the bomb and, like just if you think that would be of interest.
No,
I was
well,
happy
thank
to
you.
pass them along. Yeah, so I can send you pictures and stuff like that, no problem.
Okay,
So
cool. I think that's everything. Thank you very much for doing this.
thank you. I really, really enjoyed this. And I hope to see you guys out very, very soon.
Well,
Hopefully
yeah, and
the
I'll tell
next
you about that
event
in
in
a second, actually, after we start
April.
preparing.
Yes.
There's a couple things coming up. So
played with me. Nothing left but Rorschach stains on sheets. All eyes glow in the darkness of the cell, watching entropy increase. Hotel rooms run crimson as they bloom. Shattered impacts from on high. No silk for us, just blackout curtains and dust. Charcoal lines of each time. Columns light the sky, the walls are falling miles. There is no shelter here. Snuff the candle dim. Let the building shake the dust. Is it them or us? Every impact by our feedback is a war or lust. Let the sky fall, let the glass rain around. Break the headboard, watch the mirrors shatter down. And autumn entwined, this pity mortified. Foreground retribution from across the line.
Good, Jimmy, I can see it, boy. Good show.